Trump just issued an ultimatum to Iran: get him everything he wants or face full-scale war. On that exact same day, the US didn't strike Iran at all, for the first time in nearly 2 weeks. Here's how those two things happened at once. Let's start with the ultimatum itself. In a phone interview with French journalist Sonia Dridi, Trump was asked directly whether he was considering resuming a full-scale war with Iran. His answer: if we don't get 100% of what we want, absolutely. Dridi's report didn't specify every condition Trump was referring to, though he said for months that Iran must never be allowed to obtain a nuclear weapon, among other demands he's mentioned at various points without ever laying out a complete fixed list publicly. In the same call, when asked if he had a message for European allies, Trump said they're lucky to have him as their friend. Now here's the part that complicates that ultimatum. Friday night marked the first night in 13 consecutive nights that the United States did not strike Iran, breaking the longest sustained bombing campaign of this entire war. That 13-night run had included strikes reaching from Ahvaz to Bandar Abbas to Markazi province, hitting military command centers, drone storage facilities, and coastal surveillance sites, according to CENTCOM's own nightly statements over that stretch, a pace of operations we've tracked in earlier updates as the longest continuous campaign since fighting began in February. Speaking to reporters in the Oval Office that same Friday, Trump said the US is talking to Iran and that he believes Iran is getting more and more serious as the days go by. He immediately qualified that, adding that doesn't mean the two sides actually get to an agreement. So on the same day, Trump both paused the longest strike campaign of the war and threatened to resume full-scale war if his full list of demands isn't met. There's reporting that helps explain why the pause happened when it did. The Wall Street Journal reported that Trump had been considering resuming full-scale war and had held talks with Secretary of War Pete Hegseth and Joint Chiefs Chairman Dan Caine about potential strike options. According to that reporting, Trump ultimately decided to hold off for now and stick with engagement under the existing US-Iran Memorandum of Understanding, rather than abandon negotiations entirely. Separate reporting described military advisors warning that expanding operations further could dangerously deplete the Pentagon's already reduced stockpile of Patriot interceptor missiles, a concern distinct from anything related to Iran's own actions or negotiating posture. Patriot systems are used to intercept incoming ballistic missiles and are considered a limited, high-value resource across the US military's global posture, not something produced or replenished quickly, which is part of why advisors reportedly flagged the stockpile issue as a genuine constraint on further escalation, rather than a minor logistical footnote. The New York Times has similarly reported that Trump stepped back from plans to expand military operations against Iran after those warnings from his advisors. The economic backdrop to this decision is its own factor worth laying out. The national average US gas price rose to $4.11 a gallon on Saturday, continuing to climb as new tariffs Trump imposed on goods from more than 80 countries add financial pressure heading into the midterm elections. When Dridi asked whether Trump would follow through on threatened substantial new tariffs against the European Union, which he's accused of unfairly targeting American tech companies, he declined to answer. That combination, rising fuel costs, new tariffs, and a war now stretching past 5 months, is happening at the same time Trump is publicly floating the idea of restarting the most intense phase of the conflict. The same general period has also included a separate threat from Trump of major military punishment against Iran and its Houthi allies in Yemen, tied to attacks on shipping in the Red Sea, suggesting the potential for escalation isn't confined to Iranian territory alone, but could extend to a second front entirely. So what does a 100% demand actually mean in practical terms? On its own, it's not a specific, measurable target. Trump has repeated for months that Iran can never be allowed to have a nuclear weapon, and that's likely the core, non-negotiable piece of whatever 100% refers to. That specific demand has remained constant across nearly every phase of this war, even as other elements of the administration's position, including its stance on strikes, sanctions, and the naval blockade, have shifted multiple times. Beyond that single point, he hasn't laid out a complete public list of every condition that would need to be met, which makes 100% more of a rhetorical ceiling than a checklist anyone outside his administration can actually verify against. That ambiguity matters because it means there's no clear, publicly known threshold for when this specific threat would be considered satisfied or triggered. It also gives Trump considerable flexibility in how he characterizes any eventual outcome, since a vaguely defined 100% can be declared achieved or declared unmet, largely at his own discretion, without an independent standard for outside observers to check that claim against. That flexibility can serve a negotiating purpose, keeping Iran uncertain about exactly what would satisfy Washington, but it also makes the threat harder to evaluate as a specific, falsifiable prediction, the way a more concretely defined demand would be. The contradiction between the ultimatum and the pause is worth sitting with directly, rather than smoothing over. Threatening the resumption of full-scale war on the same day the campaign's longest strike streak breaks isn't necessarily inconsistent from a negotiating standpoint. Pausing military action while raising the stakes rhetorically is a recognizable pattern in negotiations generally, applying pressure through words while creating room for the other side to respond without further strikes, actively narrowing that window in real time. Whether that's what's actually happening here, a calculated pause paired with maximum rhetorical pressure, or whether the pause reflects a genuine logistical constraint that happened to coincide with tough public language, isn't something that can be determined with certainty from the outside. The Patriot interceptor shortage reporting suggests at least part of the pause may be about capacity rather than pure strategy, which would mean the ultimatum and the quiet night aren't as coordinated as they might first appear. There's a broader pattern we've tracked across this war that's relevant here too. Trump's rhetoric has escalated ahead of military action at some points in this conflict, and remained primarily rhetorical without an immediate matching escalation at others, meaning past behavior alone doesn't reliably predict which pattern this specific threat will follow. That history is part of why this particular combination, a maximalist ultimatum paired with an actual pause in operations, is worth treating as genuinely uncertain rather than assuming either the toughest or the most reassuring interpretation by default. It's worth being clear about what's confirmed and what remains speculative in how these pieces fit together. Confirmed, Trump's exact words to Dridi, the fact that Friday broke the 13-night strike streak, his Oval Office comments the same day, and the Journal's reporting on internal deliberations with Hegseth and Caine. Less certain. The precise reasoning behind the timing of the pause, since that requires reading intent into a decision that hasn't been explained in full public detail by the administration itself. Reporting citing military advisors' concerns about interceptor stockpiles offers one plausible explanation, but it's reporting based on sources describing internal conversations, not a public statement from the Pentagon confirming that specific rationale as the deciding factor. Treating these two categories differently, direct quotes and confirmed events on one side, sourced but unconfirmed internal reasoning on the other, is the same standard we've applied to every update in this war, and it's worth applying here even though the story itself involves the president's own words rather than a foreign government's disputed casualty count. There's also a domestic political dimension layered underneath all of this. Gas prices climbing toward the midterms, combined with new tariffs affecting a large number of trading partners, creates a domestic economic backdrop that exists alongside and separate from the war itself. Voters heading into a midterm election cycle tend to weigh pocketbook issues like fuel costs heavily, regardless of how directly those costs are tied to a specific foreign policy decision, which means the political stakes of this war's economic side effects may be rising independent of whatever happens militarily in the Gulf. Whether rising fuel costs and tariff pressure at home factor into decisions about escalating or pausing a war abroad isn't something Trump or his administration has directly addressed in the reporting available here, but the timing of both stories landing in the same week means they're part of the same broader picture the public is currently seeing, even if the two aren't formally connected in any official statement. Here's where this leaves things. Trump has publicly threatened to resume full-scale war against Iran if the US doesn't get 100% of what it wants, without specifying the complete list of demands that threshold refers to. The same day, the 13-night streak of US strikes on Iran broke, the first pause of that length since the current bombing campaign began. Reporting from the Wall Street Journal and New York Times both point to internal deliberations and at least one specific logistical concern involving Patriot missile stockpiles as factors behind stepping back from further escalation for now. Gas prices and new tariffs are adding domestic economic pressure in the same stretch of time ahead of this year's midterm elections. A separate threat of major military punishment tied to Red Sea shipping attacks means Iran's own regional allies remain a live variable in how this specific standoff could still expand, even while the direct campaign against Iran itself has paused. None of these threads has fully resolved, and Trump's own comments suggest even he isn't certain whether ongoing talks with Iran will ultimately succeed. That uncertainty, coming directly from the president himself, rather than from outside analysis, is arguably the most honest single data point in this entire update. We're not going to guess which version of this story turns out to be accurate, the calculated pause or the resource-driven one. But we do want to ask you, when a threat and a pause arrive on the exact same day, does that read to you as a deliberate strategy or as two separate decisions that just happen to land together? And does knowing about the Patriot stockpile concern change which explanation feels more likely?